9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm Marc, and this is DSR's Above Average Intelligence Show. We're going to call this actually today an emergency podcast because some incredible news has occurred that we have a guest, a perfect guest to discuss, Mr. Michael Patrick Mulroy, otherwise known as Mick, my old friend, the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, serving under Secretary James Mattis and Secretary Marc Esper. He was responsible for representing the U.S. Department of Defense for defense policy and for Middle East policy in the interagency. He's also a retired CIA paramilitary operations officer and a United States Marine. I will say that Mick, and this is going to be a serious show today, but I do always have to throw in the line that he was there in northern Iraq in a team house living with the Kurds when a colleague of mine put together a nickname for me, calling me the Fighting Lamb Chop. Mick was there for it, and I will never live that down. So
embrace it, brother. Just embrace it.
Mick, thanks for joining today. We had planned to have a whole bunch of items to discuss, pending Israeli strike in Iran, talk about some analytic failures of the U.S. intelligence community, but we got to start with the breaking news, the death of Yayah Sinwar. Amazingly enough, and let's just start off. It looks like from a reservist Israeli infantry unit who stumbles upon them in Rafah. Of course, a location where the international community was howling that the Israelis should not go in. Well, they did. There were forces on the ground, and I think you might have tweeted, or not tweeted, you might have sent me this note earlier. I think that an Israeli private will never be able to buy a beer again in Israel in his life. Your thoughts on
That's true.
Right.
That's true. And I'm going to use what you just said because it is important to point out that Sinwar was in Rafah.
Yeah.
Right. Next time I go yapping on the air, I'm gonna bring that out. Big day. Obviously, we started hearing early on. As you know from chasing people all over the world, oftentimes the question for them is: do you move with a substantial security force, or does that just highlight you as somebody that needs to be killed or captured, or do you move with a small one? Which then just kind of blend in with the crowd. And I think obviously, and if everything that we've seen reported is right, he chose the latter. He chose to move probably from what he viewed as a safe site to another safe site with a small group so he wouldn't draw attention. But some, private, had his head on a swivel and took him out. And I do think he will not be buying a drink in Israel for the rest of his life. God bless him. So a great day. The question is now, what comes next, right? Because Sinwar was, he was such a powerful figure inside Hamas for so long. He was the leader, right? After Haniyeh was killed, he was the primary operational planner. So not just a political leader, but the primary operational planner. And he was probably the biggest resistance to a ceasefire, which the White House has highlighted today, that they believe that Sinwar was never going to agree to a ceasefire. Right. So this could be an opportunity, and I think all those family members of the hostages are viewing it as such, that this could be an opportunity to change the trajectory of the negotiations.
I just was off. I know you've been doing your hits on ABC. I just got done with MSNBC, and right before me, talk about following a powerful segment was a hostage family of one of the American hostages who are still presumably alive in Gaza, and it was crushing to see. First of all, they're incredibly hopeful, but I think you bring up something that what I believe is going to happen. There's certainly going to be celebration in Israel, but there's also going to be now enormous pressure from the hostage families because number one, or just talk about this a little bit. Number one, are they in danger right now? Was there any kind of orders to kill the hostages if Sinwar was ever killed? But I would think that also Israel is in quite a better negotiating position. So the question is, will Netanyahu take this as an opportunity to go for frankly, a ceasefire hostage deal? I mean, so Netanyahu is certainly going to, and others are going to say this ratifies their strategy of kind of going heavy. But when is enough for Gaza? They've accomplished their key goal in killing Sinwar. That can help with the trauma of the Israeli people after October 7th, but they got to get their hostages back. And 12 hours ago, that wasn't even happening.
Right. And I think this is twofold opportunity here. So diplomatically, if anybody else is chosen, they will be viewed as more likely to get to a ceasefire. And if Khalil El-Hayya, who is at least designated as the deputy, if he moves up, I believe, according to reports I heard today, he's already in Doha and he's on the political side. So if he has the authority to actually speak for the Hamas organization in Gaza, it's better than having Sinwar being the one that speaks for that organization. The second one, and I think, obviously you'll see this as well, but hasn't been covered that much, is Sinwar was a hammer. He did all the counterintelligence for Hamas at one time. That's how he got the nickname, the butcher of Khan Yunis for killing Palestinians. His men were terrified of him. And all the individuals that are holding these hostages likely were terrified of him. If I was Shin Bet right now, I would be looking for opportunities. They're leaderless, I imagine, right now. I would be reaching out, trying to find these individuals that are holding hostages and offering them, whether, obviously financial rewards, clemency, whatever, to try to take advantage of the chaos that was likely caused by Sinwar's death. Seeing if any of them would be willing to, approach IDF position and potentially turn over a hostage. I'm not saying it's all going to work, but this is an opportunity that you have to take advantage of, because it's got to be chaos with Hamas, militants, fighters, terrorists inside Gaza going, what's coming next? And maybe I'm next, and maybe I ought to take the best off-road to this, which is taking my valuable hostages, turning them over to the IDF, and somehow getting out of this situation. So I would take both opportunities right now.
And let's also kind of reflect. I'm sure your phone blew up. Mine certainly did, from our old colleagues. 46 Americans were killed on October 7th. Mm-hmm. That's a mass casualty terrorist event. So many people, and I think there's obvious reasons for this, primarily anti-Semitism, but so many people don't see a dual citizen Israeli as an American. But in our old world, they are. If you have a blue passport and they had a blue passport, it doesn't matter. That is the only thing that is critical. And so, I remember actually sitting on the Hamas desk in 1997 in CTC, the first operational desk where I worked. And so I think there certainly is a lot of satisfaction, and I'm sure certainly from our old colleagues who I've heard from, but even inside our old place, our old building, the counterterrorism world, both U.S. intelligence community, special operations community, because after all, 46 Americans were killed. And don't forget, there are still 7 Americans still out there. So no tears shed and more work to do.
Absolutely. And that does seem to be forgotten a lot. Like the U.S. is not just a mediator in this, right? We're a aggrieved party. And I think we should view it more like that. Yes, obviously there's more Israelis than Americans, but so what? I mean, it is important to the Israelis, but from the U.S. side and from the national security side, CIA, DOD, you don't couch or characterize Americans as less than. They're Americans. They're Americans. So we should treat it like that, and that both from the desk and for the current Americans that are held hostage. So when we go into these mediations, we're not just there as Switzerland. We're there as an aggrieved party, and we should treat it as such. And our allies and partners should view it that way as well, whether it's Egypt or Qatar or whoever is the other part of this equation when it comes to negotiations. And Israel, to be frank.
Right.
It's not just
so I guess
stars.
One of the things that I think you've done that has enormous value in your, obviously you have doing a lot of things professionally, but even your work as a commentator now is that you spend some time in Israel. I'm sure you have sent some notes to some former Israeli colleagues, congratulating them. Perhaps is a strong word, but just again, it's satisfaction for a job well done. But you spent time in Israel, so I think one of the things that's not talked about enough is the trauma that the Israelis felt after October 7th. Do you think this gives some kind of psychological closure? This was HVT-1. This is the guy responsible for the mass murder and rape of 1,200 Israelis. What's your thought? I know you're not in Israel now. I think you were there recently, but if you were there now, what do you think you'd be hearing from kind of Israelis on the street?
So I do think it'd be twofold. One, I do think it would be a relief. It was just like when we got bin Laden, where it was just this collective catharsis in the United States, including some people who hadn't even thought about him in a long time. But when he was actually dead, it was it was a collective, happiness, if you will, or, just relief. I guess it depends on how you characterize it. Some would say happy. Some would say it was a relief. Some would say it was just it's closing a brutal chapter. And I think that's probably what's going on from everything I can see and hear in Israel right now. And when you go there and they have a place where you can go and they have all sorts of tributes to those that were killed and those that were taken hostages. And it's extraordinarily moving for anybody to go through there, and you can just see the level of collective trauma that the Israelis have. In fact, when I first went right after October 7th, and me and my business partner Eric Ulrich were running down the front. They have a nice place to run right by the ocean. We started noticing shoes, and then we realized that they were representing the shoes of every person that was killed.
Right. And
there was little bitty kid shoes,
Yep.
And it doesn't matter if you're Israeli or anybody else. That should affect you, So I think for the Israelis, for certain, for anybody, this should be a good day to see that this person whose level of callousness is, almost unmatched, is no longer with us, and he ended up with a bullet through the head.
Yep. Amen. Again, from an Israeli reservist who, perhaps a couple of months ago was going to his job bartending at some trendy club in
Yes.
Tel Aviv, and now will never have to buy a drink again. But yeah, let's there's so much to talk about. Again, your insight into this, into a very significant day. Thank you for that. But there's something else that's also kind of weighing on everyone's mind right now, and that is the pending Israeli response to the Iranian ballistic missile attack of 180 missiles coming down on Israel. Not doing damage in terms of human life, but I think it's a little surprising with the forensics that a whole bunch of these got through. But ultimately, Israel believes that they have to respond. There's been obviously some pressure from the United States government to limit this response. And if we weren't, originally we are going to talk about that. But now, of course, the death of Sinwar has eclipsed that. But that's coming because I think the Israelis certainly believe they have to do something. What are your thoughts? What are you hearing? And maybe even, do you think the death of Sinwar has any bearing on that? Is it significant in terms of what Israel will do?
Well, that is a good question. I do think the Israelis will still feel like they have to respond. This was, over 200 ballistic missiles, which are very difficult to shoot down, even with the sophisticated systems that they have. Like, to your point, some of them did get through. I mean, if you shoot drones, they take like an hour and a half to get there from Iran. I mean, you can shoot them down with aircraft, right? Ballistic missiles, they come in so fast that you really only can shoot them down when they're on their last line coming in. And if you miss, you miss. And the Iranians said they were going after the headquarters of Mossad. The headquarters of Mossad's in Tel Aviv, right? So the chances of them hitting civilian targets are very high, especially considering the amount of ballistic missiles they launched at it. So I think Israel has to respond to this. I believe they were legitimately looking at nuclear sites. They certainly were looking at energy infrastructure, but I do think the United States has got them off of that. Potentially part of that, and I don't know, but the deployment of the THAAD came right before, it was reported that the Israeli government decided not to go after the nuclear and energy targets. So it might have had something to do with it. But that doesn't mean it's not going to be a substantial strike, right? There's a lot of military targets in Iran, to include the head of the IRGC. They are in Tehran, as I believe. This could be not just missile production facilities and bases. It could also be the headquarters of IRGC. It could be other IRGC targets. It could be the IRGC Navy. It's really difficult to hide a ship, right? So unless they're moving them out right now, you could see an array of targets get hit. And then the question is, what does Iran do? Do they respond? They said they will, which is one of the reasons why the THAAD has been, I think, is up and probably operational by now in Israel.
So obviously you have sources and methods to protect, but I do want to get your question on the Iranian nuclear program, and not in the sense of where they are on it, But there's been so much talk of a potential Israeli strike. And I tend to agree with you. I don't think that Israelis are going to strike any kind of Iranian nuclear targets now. But if they climb up that escalatory ladder, that's going to be on the table, which begs the question. And, I know you got to be careful on this based on previous roles but I think you can answer this question is, do the Israelis need our assistance to do significant damage against the Iranian nuclear program, or do they have, is there weaponry advanced enough? Do they have refueling capabilities where they could do enough damage? I mean, I think that's the thing that I think a lot of people question, because, in one sense, if you're going to take a shot at the Iranian nuclear program, if you're going to go after the king, you better kill it. And so it would seem to me a joint, full-on U.S.-Israeli strike, forget all the politics behind it, the geopolitics behind it, that is more effective than if the Israelis go it alone. But I guess the question is, do you think they can? Can they take a shot at the Iranian nuclear program and do enough damage without our assistance?
So you're right. I have to be a little bit careful about how I answer this. But,
knowledge, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. But the percentage of success goes dramatically up with the U.S. participating. Right. There are certain munitions in their public, and this is an interesting part to this. They're called massive ordnance penetrators, GBU 57. It's a 27,000 pound bomb, right? So we've been talking about 2,000 pound bombs and being substantial. The U.S., according to the DOD, just dropped a few on the Houthi facilities in Yemen that are underground. Right. So, that seems a bit of an overkill. I mean, I'm happy they did it, but they were B-2s that took off from the United States and dropped these. So it could also be a test run. I'm just saying. I have no knowledge of that, but it just seems a little coincidental, right? Obviously, the United States doesn't, unless you believe their public statements, doesn't want to see the nuclear facilities struck this time. But to your point, if you had 3 courses of action, if you were Israel, you might say, okay, well, we'll launch against military targets. If that Iran sends 400 ballistic missiles, including hypersonic, then we're going to the energy. Then if they do it again, then we're going to the nuclear, and maybe they've already talked to the United States about potential participation. If we don't participate, they could set back the program, but to your point, if you go into the king, you got to kill him. And I think maybe there's some version of this in discussions with the United States. And also, of course, depends on what Iran does. How significant is their response? Do we start seeing them, race toward a nuclear weapon? Obviously the enrichment first and then weaponizing it, which they could get supercharged by Russia, right? Russia could step in and help them, or potentially even give them one. So there's all sorts of variables that are out there. But I do think, and again, this is just pure speculation on my part. It's interesting that they both did that level of a strike. These are very expensive munitions. And then highlighted not only that they did it, but it was a GBU 57, right? So, and the Iranians are like, oh, yeah, that's one thing. It penetrates, and this is all public, it penetrates 200 feet before it even detonates. So it's a fascinating how they came up with it. I don't want to get sidetracked, but apparently one engineer saw after a hurricane that a straw punched through a board. And then he was trying to figure out how something so light, but it was so long and cylindrical, made it through the board, and then he came up with the design. But you don't want that thing dropped on you, period, because it's. And
I think what you're also alluding to is the Israelis do not have the GBU 57. That's just in the U.S. inventory, I believe.
I believe it's just in the U.S. inventory. Yes,
that's a good point there. Well, some really extraordinary developments that I think are going to come in the next several days. And let me just press you one other quick point. Do you think the death of Sinwar will have any effect on Israeli planning? Maybe you addressed that. I apologize, but would that give Netanyahu more impetus? I mean, I guess, and what I want to say is the axis of resistance has been absolutely crushed. Whether you condemn or condone Israeli activities in Gaza, Hamas is not an organization capable of carrying out October 7th, and Yayah Sinwar is now dead. They have not just done decapitation strikes on Hezbollah. They've essentially, conducted open heart surgery with 1, 2, 3, 4 tiers of leadership and operatives killed. 2/3 of their missile inventory is now done. there's one sense that, and I think you're going to hear this from the Israeli right, that, okay, you all keep telling us to slow down, to take the win, but look what we have right now. We have the possibility of changing kind of the dynamics of the Middle East, let alone and then there's the notion of kind of political change in Lebanon, what a lot of people are pushing. So do you think perhaps that the Israelis will say, okay, you know what, the death of Sinwar is not actually going to cause us to take a knee? We're going to go and keep going because the axis of resistance is reeling. And in some ways, I think those of us who comment on this have to kind of sit back and think there's a point there. I'm not sure this administration feels the same way, but I see their point. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I used to coach boxing, and one of my guys got, or I used to box obviously, but one of my guys got their opponent on the ropes, and he's going down. I never said, "Hey, he's about to fall down, so just step back." Let's get it over with, right? I mean, it's better for everybody, and it's especially better in a combat, not a sport. So I think there is some value to that. But there's also a point that Netanyahu could look at and say, well, I've turned the tides on my political, standing, if you will. I do have an issue with my IDF, who is constantly saying that they're getting overtasked and,
Right.
they need to do things in Gaza to prepare and do things in Lebanon. And quite frankly, Hamas is in disarray. So I think he'd like an official ceasefire. Obviously, the hostages to be released would be
Right.
huge. Morally and politically. So I think they're going to look at this as an opportunity. But if Hamas isn't willing to play, the other issue with Hamas is it might just be a gaggle of lunatics right now, right? And meaning that there's nobody in charge. So it doesn't matter who's sitting in, the Four Seasons in Doha negotiating with whoever, that he doesn't have anything, any authority. I don't know if that's the case. I hope it's not the case. But that's another thing that Israel's probably looking at. So if whoever is going to be appointed is in Doha and agrees to something, nobody will believe it until hostages start being released. That's when they'll see, okay, then this was real. If that's not the case and there is no control, then Israel really doesn't have a choice but to try to take Hamas down to the lowest level of capacity that they can, which means destroying the tunnels, finding their arsenals and destroying them, killing as many terrorists as you can, and then preventing them from rearming. I think that's probably their main objectives right now, and they are doable. It's amazing when you hear people talk about, well, Hamas is winning. It's like, wow. So 42,000 dead in Gaza, 85% of the structures are destroyed, and like if you call that a win, then your characterization of victory has nothing to do with what's good for the Palestinian people. It's literally some bizarre, we managed to survive at all. So we have been victorious. They're not. They are systematically being destroyed, and they're taking the Palestinian people with them in Gaza.